It has been a while since I made a full Palette Master Element calibration walkthrough, and I feel that this is a great time to do that. With multiple versions of Palette Master Element out, a lot of improvement in the software, and many more of you are now getting into BenQ SW displays for the hardware calibration feature. So let's jump into it together. I'm Art and ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Before we talk about Palette Master Element and go into the calibration process, this is a fairly longer video. I will have a link and timestamp in the description below so you can skip to the portion that you want to view. To start us off on this comprehensive calibration guide, we first need to talk about the different versions of Palette Master Element that are out there. If you need to download these previous versions, I will have a link to them in the description below this video. Secondly, the version of Palette Master Element that I'll be discussing here is 1.3.8, 0.10, and 0.11. 1.3.9 is being skipped here because there is a bug in the program that causes the LUT not to be written to the display completely. So this way, every time you turn the display on or off, and also when you connect and reconnect the display, sometimes the color would go really strange and the contrast would increase. And that is the reason why we're not talking about that version. With 3.3 version, there are a few things that you need to know, and it also depends on the SW display that you may have. So first of all, let's start out with the SW2700PT, which is the first in the lineup. Throughout the years, BenQ have gone in and improved the firmware on these displays, and with the SW2700PT, there are two firmware versions out there. So there is an old firmware version, and the way how you find this out is to look at the serial number tag on the back of the display. It's usually between the power cord input and all of the rest of the input on the display. You will see a regulation tag there. On that tag, there is something that says MFG date. If your SW2700PT has an MFG date of 2016 or before, that means you're running on the old firmware. If your SW2700PT has an MFG date of 2017 or after, then you're running on the latest firmware. The differences between these two is that on the old firmware of the SW2700PT, and is also the one that I have here, Palette Master Element version 1.3.11 will not calibrate it. But if you have the new firmware version, 0.11 will calibrate it just fine. It is fine for Palette Master Element 1.3.10 and 0.8 as you see there. The other thing to note too about the old firmware version is that the only RGB primary that you can choose when you run the calibration on these display is panel native. You cannot change it to Adobe RGB, sRGB, Rec 709. It doesn't allow you to do that for this old firmware version. For the new firmware version, you can use any RGB primary you like, and as I mentioned, it's also compatible with Palette Master Element 1.3.11. Now, before you go on and ask these questions in a comment, I can tell you right now is that there is no way to upgrade the firmware on the SW2700PT on your own, nor is BenQ doing any sent in for a firmware upgrade. To be honest with you though, that is a really small feature and I wouldn't really worry about it too much. Next up, if you have any other SW display in the lineup, all these three versions will work with it just fine. So if you have the SW320, 240, SW271, or 270C, all these will work just fine. Another thing that I want to talk about is the color shift bug that you may have been seeing in Adobe software, for example, in Photoshop, Camera Raw, or in Lightroom when you go from Library module to Develop module. In 1.3.8, the way to avoid that issue is to calibrate your display in panel native. However, if you're running 1.3.10 or 0.11, you can choose any RGB primary now, and that bug is now fixed. So you can calibrate in Adobe RGB, sRGB, whatever color mode or RGB primary you choose, you should be fine on that one. And lastly, I've been doing extensive tests on all these three versions of Palette Master Element, and I can tell you this. The most stable version to run right now is 1.3.10. Comparing 0.10 to 0.11, I find that on the same computer, running and connecting to the same display, 0.11 tend to produce a delta E that is slightly higher than the 0.10 version of a software. So at this point in time, I recommend sticking with 1.3.10. Next up, let's talk about the best calibration practice or the best combinational setting you can use for both Mac and PC. I have done so many videos in the past, and I know that some of you have commented that in one video I recommend one way and the other video I recommended the other way. And that is because Palette Master Element keeps getting updated. So these information that I'm presenting and sharing with you is always going to be evolving based on the version of a software that have come out and what is the best optimal setting for that version of a software and computer that you're running. But I feel that at this point in time, we have pretty much settled into a good solution. So let's take a look at that. So what we have here is for the best setting. For Macintosh setting, use ICC Profile version 4. For PC, when you go in to run the calibration, change the ICC version to 2. This way it doesn't conflict with operating system, and that ICC will be read properly by the different programs that are using the software running on Windows. The only difference here you're going to see in this chart is that if you're running on a Macintosh system, and let's start out with if you're running Palette Master Element either 0.10 or 0.11 on a Mac. For the best setting for these two versions, what you want to do is set your RGB primary to panel native, black point to relative, and for the profile type, you want to choose matrix. You don't want to choose any LUT profile type if you're running 0.10 or 0.11 because there is a bug in the software that causes that ICC profile to sometimes quit your system abruptly and put you back at the login screen of your system, ergo quitting all of your software and the flow that you're working in. So double check and set the ICC profile type to matrix if you're running on 0.10 and 0.11 on a Macintosh system. If you're running on Palette Master Element version 1.3.8, the best setting is panel native, relative black, and 16-bit LUT for the profile type. This is also the same setting if you're running on a Windows PC. For the best setting, again, panel native, relative black, and 16-bit LUT as a profile type. There is no bug in my testing whatsoever, so you are safe there for all the versions of Palette Master Element. Let's talk about next the safe setting. Let's say you have gone in and run the calibration with panel native and you get a fail validation. Well, the next thing to do is to try out the safe setting because this is probably one of what I call the vanilla setting, but it's also the safest one as well. If you are having the validation failure or if you try this and you're still getting validation failure, what I would do is check out my previous videos. I have done numerous troubleshooting videos on what you can do to try to resolve those issues. All right, so the setting for this is going to be the same for both Mac and PC, and that is to set the RGB primary to Adobe RGB, setting the black point to relative, and the profile type to matrix. Again, this is the same for Mac and PC, and this applies for all of the versions of Palette Master Element that you may be running. So this is a safe one. Lastly, this is for those of you who are doing color grading on DaVinci Resolve. Resolve itself does not color manage, so what you have to do is calibrate your display to the RGB primary or the color gamut that you want to view your footage on. My recommendation here is to use Rec 709. Also, change the gamma from the photo default of 2.2 to the video standard of 2.4. Relative black will be good to use, and if you're running on a Macintosh system, depending on the version of Palette Master Element they're using, the setting will be slightly different for the profile type. If you're running on 0.10 or 0.11, use matrix as the profile type because using LUT can cause your system to quit all the programs and lock you out to the login screen, therefore disrupting your workflow. If you're running on Palette Master Element version 1.3.8, you can stick with Rec 709, relative black, gamma 2.4, and then you can also choose 16-bit LUT as the profile type. This also happens to be the same setting for Windows running on any version of Palette Master Element. 16-bit LUT is going to be the setting to use here. For these DaVinci Resolve setting, I also have an asterisk there too. The reason why is because I don't primary edit in DaVinci Resolve and I haven't extensively tested all these settings out, but this recommendation should work for majority of BenQ SW displays are out there. If you're able to calibrate your display and get it to pass using the safe or vanilla setting, then this setting should also work as well. Next thing that I want to discuss here is the compatible device. And I'm not going to talk about all the devices, but what I'm really going to talk about is the X-Rite i1 Studio class device. So there are two types of device that falls into this category. One of them is a colorimeter, the other one is a color spectrophotometer, and one of them is compatible, the other one is not. So let's talk about the non-compatible one first, and that is the colorimeter. Again, it looks very similar to the i1 Display Pro or the i1 Display Pro Plus that I have here. But the thing is that on the side, you will see that it says i1 Display Studio. If your device says Studio on the side of it, that is a colorimeter, and that model of device is not compatible with Palette Master Element. This also applies to if you have a Color Monkey display, which is a device that looks like what you see on the screen right now. The next category device that is compatible with Palette Master Element is the X-Rite i1 Studio or the X-Rite Color Monkey Photo. That is the previous device, and that is the device that looks like this. The distinguishment between the two is that the colorimeter will only calibrate displays and projectors, where this one is more of a universal device where it will calibrate display projectors, it will profile scanners, it will also profile your printer paper and also read color. So it's a more of a universal device. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will calibrate the display any better than a colorimeter will though. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get talking about calibration. Before we jump into Palette Master Element, remember to leave your display running for at least 15 minutes before the calibration. This way, the backlight has the opportunity to warm up. This includes for all the BenQ SW as well. Secondly, there are settings that you need to disable on both Mac and PC. The link to those are in the description below this video. Make sure you go in and disable those settings before because they can conflict with the way how the color is being displayed on your computer. And lastly, remember to go into the power setting of your computer and change the screen off duration and also the computer sleep duration, preferably to never. This way it doesn't sleep and the screen doesn't go off during calibration. Now we're ready to start with Palette Master Element. To make this guide universal, we have to quickly talk about the setup that I have. This way you can substitute the equipment that you own in for the pieces that I'm using for this demonstration. Starting out, I have a 16-inch MacBook Pro that's linked up to the BenQ SW2700PT, and this is the one that is running on the old firmware version. So when we launch Palette Master Element, you will see that the only RGB primary that I can choose is panel native. For this Macintosh system, any computer running Macintosh can be substituted in here. That would be iMac, iMac Pro, Mac Mini, or even the Mac Pro. For the device that I'll be using to calibrate on this end, this is the X-Rite i1 Studio. This is their color spectrophotometer. This device will do display, projectors, it will profile printers, scanners, and also read color. So this is the universal device that we're going to be using here. And for this one, there is a slight difference in the initial setup to get this calibration started than if you would use a colorimeter. On this side, I have a PC setup. This is a Dell XPS 15, but again, substitute any PC running any version of Windows on here. As long as that version of Windows is compatible with Palette Master Element, you'll be good. I have this linked up to the SW2700C, and for the calibration device that I'll be using here, this is the X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus. This is a colorimeter. This is one of the more, I would say, easier device to use than the color spectrophotometer, and it also calibrates faster than a color spectrophotometer as well. So let's start us out by calibrating the SW2700PT, and what I'm going to do is start the calibration process for both the colorimeter and also the color spectrophotometer, so you can see the differences between the two. And then afterwards, what we're going to do is finish the calibration and also run the validation using only one device. So we're going to be sticking with this device using the color spectrophotometer. So if you have this device, this is probably a great video for you. But if you have the colorimeter, this is also going to be a fantastic video because the entire process, again, is very similar to each other. So let's start our calibration. I'm going to first focus on the Macintosh system. However, one thing that I want to let you know before is that for both Mac and PC, I'm running on the same version of Palette Master Element, and that is 1.3.10. I have tested 1.3.11 extensively, and my conclusion, as I mentioned earlier in this video, is that 1.3.10 produced a result that's slightly better than 0.11 at this point in time. So let's launch Palette Master Element. And when you do so, if you're not running on the latest version, the program is really eager to have you update. And it's going to say a newer version is available. Would you like to update? The default is for you to say yes. But the thing is this, if your program, the version that you have is running just fine, is calibrating perfectly, there is really no reason to upgrade. If there is a bug on this version that is preventing you from getting the calibration that you like, then you may want to consider upgrading at that point. And also subscribe to my channel because usually when an update comes, I'll have a video about it. For this, we're going to click on No. I already have the i1 Studio linked up and is already showing a green check mark, meaning that it's working great, so I don't have to do check sensor. I will choose Advanced Mode, Profiling, and this is where we will go in to set our settings up. At the very top, you will notice that it says Default Panel Native, and if I click on that drop-down list, there are no other modes I can choose. The other thing too is that Normally where my cursor is right now between the white point and luminance, there is a drop-down list that says RGB Primary. The reason why it doesn't have it on here is because this is the SW2700PT running on the old firmware, and you cannot calibrate this display with any RGB primary other than panel native. For the setting here, I'll leave the white point at D65, which again is the best white point to use to run any type of work out there. The only time you want to change it into D50 or D55 if you're doing pre-press run work. This also includes if you're printing at home. If you have an inkjet printer, D65 is still going to produce the best value or the best white point you can use. Next up is luminance. And the range that I recommend that you set this to is anywhere between 80 to 120 candela. And this will work well for all type of creative work, photography, for video, for creative design work. The thing is this, even though you're not printing, what you want to do is you want to calibrate your display to a brightness that you can use, and you have a reference brightness at that point. You can't really calibrate your display to full brightness because all the displays out there are going to be different brightness and different color balance and so forth. So we want to make sure the one that we have here is of reference value, and this is one of the best brightness settings to use here. For me, I will choose 80. Gamma, for this one, I'm going to leave at 2.2 because I'm doing photography work. If you should do video work, you should go in and change the gamma to 2.4. Black point, I will choose relative. Mode, you can leave in an XY, don't have to worry about that. Click on next. Next is the measurement screen. This is where you would choose the calibration slot that you want to use. On the older SW displays, there are 2 calibration slots. On the newer one, there are 3 hardware calibration slots. Some of the ways how you can use these calibration slots, for instance, if you have multiple computers that you're constantly linking to this display, you can have slot 1 be computer A, slot 2 be computer B. Or what you can also do is use one computer and calibrate slot 1 to one brightness, slot 2 to a different brightness. And another thing that you can do as well is calibrate slot 1 to one RGB primary and slot 2 to another RGB primary. There are so many creative uses that you can do for these hardware calibration slots. And I think that having multiple of them can be a really great thing. For this one, I will choose calibration 1. So this is going to go in slot 1. The ICC profile name, the default one, will give you a lot of information about the files, including the date and the time that the profile was created. I have a tendency to just leave it the way how it is. Right below it is system distribution. Most of the time, I leave this unchecked, especially on a Macintosh system, because it doesn't really do anything. Some of you may believe otherwise, but it really doesn't do anything. This is really there when you have multiple users that can log into a system. This is so that the other users can access the ICC profile. But the way how Apple has been designing their operating system for the past few releases or the few major versions, they have sandboxed it so much so that even if you check that option, the other users still don't have access to the ICC profile. I made a video on how to share the ICC profile with multiple users on a Macintosh system. You can check that out in the description below this video. ICC profile version, leave it at 4 because I'm running on 1.3.10. What I'm going to do is leave the profile type and matrix, and patch size, I recommend choosing large. And from there, we'll start our measurement. The thing is this, for this one, I am using a color spectrophotometer, and the way how we get started with this device is much different than the way how we would with a colorimeter such as this one. So if you're using any color spectrophotometer, the first thing that you have to do is run a calibration on it. So for these devices, the calibration is built in. If you have the X-Rite i1 Pro, i1 Pro 2, or i1 Pro 3, the calibration itself is actually on the base of the device, and you have to run the calibration there first before you can calibrate the display. To do this, for these devices, simply rotate that black ring. You can see that I'm rotating it right now. So you want that line there, that dash, to be pointing towards that corner that looks like a star symbol. And if you match the device itself to the orientation of the device to what you're seeing on the screen, that should match up closely as well, and is showing you where you want to point the calibration to. Inside here, there is a white disc or a white ceramic tile that is custom calibrated to this specific calibrator. So that's really cool. And what we're going to do is click on continue. What it's doing now is that it's reading the white point and is doing a custom white balance and custom calibration on this sensor before, and now it's telling me to rotate this. And again, I'm going to grab the black ring and rotate it so that this is pointing down towards that opening. What we're going to do next is put this spectrophotometer into the hanger from it to hang it from the display. And again, there's also one curved corner, which is the one up there. And the other thing too is that the opening here should match with the harder opening on the bottom of the device. So I will put that in, zip it up. The other thing that we always have to remember when we're running using a color spectrophotometer, especially for this one, is that right down here, there is a little door there, a little cover that opens up. You want to open this cover up because if you don't, the calibration will run as if everything is fine. But the way how the LUT is going to be written to display, it's going to not really work. That means your display is going to be measuring dark all the time. So what it's going to do is make your display super, super bright. And that's not something that works really well. Now that you have that done, you have this in the holder, you have it oriented correctly, and you have the cover opening set. We're going to click on continue. I'm going to tilt the display back and I'll put this device on the display. I'll hang it there. Make sure it lays flat on the display. And again, you can be in a bright environment like this and run the calibration. You'll be perfectly fine. From here, click on continue. While that's going, let's look at the PC side of things. I'll launch Palette Master Element. And like on the Macintosh side, it will also check the server if you're not running on the latest version, and it will encourage you to update. If the current version that you're working is running just fine, say no. I have the X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus already linked in. This is already checked, so this is good. I'll go to Advanced and then click on Start. Profiling, next. Here is a normal Palette Master Element where you can choose the different RGB Primary and the different default at the very top there. So BenQ has a couple of preset dial in. However, you can always go in and change your own too. White point, I will leave it at D65. RGB Primary, I'm going to use the best settings, so I will choose Panel Native. And the moment I change this RGB Primary in the middle of the screen to Panel Native, you will notice at the top right away that the default has now changed from whatever it was before Photographer Web Design, whatever you may have chosen, into custom setting. This is perfectly normal and that's okay. Next up is luminance. I will choose my luminance at 80. Gamma, I will leave this at 2.2. If you're doing video work or color grading, change the gamma to 2.4. Black point, I will use relative. Color mode XY is perfectly fine. Leave that at the default. And what I'm going to use is the calibration 1 for this. I'll leave the file name at the default. Again, profile distribution on the PC side doesn't even make sense at all, because if you look at the location where the profile is installed, pretty much any user on the system have access to that. They may have to go in and add it in manually, but they have access to that. Profile version, go to 2. Profile type, we are going to choose 16-bit LUT, patch size large. And this is how you would start a calibration on a PC with a colorimeter. So if you have the X-Rite devices, the i1 Display Pro or Pro Plus, it will tell you to open the cover up and then hang the device from the display, like so. And once you click continue, it will show an outline of the device. This is also going to be very similar if you use a Spider device or any other colorimeter device to run the calibration on your SW display using Palette Master Element. I'm not going to go through with this calibration. We're going to go back and focus on the PC because that's the one that we're going to be using to finish and then validating our calibration. Another thing to note too that I mentioned briefly before is that if you use a color spectrophotometer to run a calibration on your display, this will take longer than if you would use a colorimeter such as this. So depending on the device you use, I think the color accuracy between both of these devices come really close to each other. Just because this one can do everything, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's better at calibrating display. From the result that I have seen running calibration with all these devices, I have a tendency to prefer the calibration that's coming from an X-Rite i1 Display Pro or the i1 Display Pro Plus more, just because I feel that the color is better, more accurate for displays. Again, if you have this device and you do paper profiling and everything, this is a fantastic device to have. I'm just lucky because I have all the devices tested out in my studio. So we'll wait for this to finish and then we'll talk about validation. briefly discuss delta E, and then conclude this video. So it's in the last stages now where it is writing a LUT to the display. That is writing the information that it was just measuring to the lookup table on the display. Once this is done, we'll be able to do a validation. And again, the calibration part is the one that takes a longer time. The validation should be done in almost no time at all because it's just reading the color value. I'm just going to pull, well, what I'm going to do is this. Let's pull this window to the side. This way I can leave the calibrator where it is. And the thing is that you can just leave this in place because you're going to come back in and run a validation anyway. There's really no point moving it or tilting the display back. So target luminance is 80. We were able to achieve 79.8941. I mean, honestly, even if it is 85, don't worry about it too much. And as I mentioned before, a candela value difference of about 10 is really hard to be discernible with normal human vision. The color temperature is 6505 and we have achieved 6547. For color temperature, if you're about a few hundred kelvins off, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But generally, if you're able to get a good calibration, it will land really close to the 6500K mark. From here, we'll click on Validate Calibration. And again, because this is a color spectrophotometer, it's going to ask to run a calibration first. So we're going to have to calibrate the device. So once you click continue, now it's going to tell you to move this to the measuring position. Click continue one more time and this should pop up the alignment box. Press continue on the dialog and now it should measure the color, and then after this we are going to get a delta E value and a profile validation. So it has passive validation with an average delta E of 0.52 and a max delta E of 0.95. This is absolutely fantastic. Anytime you can get a delta E value below 1, this is just mind-blowing amazing. So in general, the rule of thumb about delta E is that you want that number to be lower, the better. But here's the thing. These panels, BenQ guarantee that you're going to get a delta E value below 2. And if you run a custom calibration and your delta E max is at 2.45, 2.5 or something like that, you're still going to be fine. The thing is this, with the delta E value, for us to really see a difference, we have to see something with a delta E value of about 3. And for us to really be able to visualize those differences between the delta E values for a specific color, we have to see them side by side next to each other. If there is a color in between them or a black, gray, white background, whatever that may be, that's separating the two, our eyes, for the most part, can discern the difference between the delta E value of 2 or 3. And that's just something to always remember, too, is that these are numbers to let you know how good the display is performing, but I wouldn't get too obsessed with this number. The other thing, too, is that if you want to learn more about delta E, I will have a link to the delta E video that I made in the description below, and that does a full comparison and a full explanation between all the delta E colors and show you when can you visualize the delta E differences. So I hope that you find this guide on how to calibrate your BenQ SW display helpful. If you have any questions about this, leave them in the comment section below. Give this video a like, subscribe if you're new, hit on the bell to be notified every time I upload cool new guides like this, and until next time, ArtIsRight.